Okay, perfect. So we're going to get started, and so I'd like to thank each of you for joining us um, as panelists for this very enriching and very important discussion around brutality behind bars, the idea of correctional officer accountability. And again, I thank each of you for joining as leaders and people who are in the field and doing the great work to address issues around correctional officer abuse, but equally as important, just to make sure that human beings are treated fairly while they're incarcerated. And so as each of you know, as panelists, we've seen a growing attention that's paid to addressing police reforms, divesting from police officers to put more money into the communities, the elimination of brutality. And now there's a growing need to address the brutality behind bars. And we noticed that, particularly, we're not suggesting that all correctional officers, but correctional officer accountability is critical to people who are inside. And each of you as leaders on this panel will obviously share your thoughts and calls to action on how we can have more transparency and accountability in those areas. There's a real urgent need in New York State right now, and really a national demand for an end to police brutality. And we know that that's long overdue. Even though we know that Civil Rights Law 50A has been repealed by Governor Cuomo, and it allows now civilians to be able to access police officers' records, we want the same to be true across the board, and that correctional officers also be held to the same kind of standard. As we look at Black Lives Matter in this age, we know that the use of tactics to quell what is deemed unrest now in our communities is almost akin to how correctional officers routinely employ tasers and stun guns and pepper guns, pepper balls and restraints in chairs. This is nationally as well as in New York State. And so even for sometimes less threatening kind of behaviors, somewhat like an instance where someone doesn't get off a phone call immediately, could result in correctional officer abuse. Someone complained about not receiving a visit, could result in excessive force used. And so we want to talk about that today. And I'd like to start off with obviously talking to Jai Diamond. And Jai, thank you so much for joining us, because as we think about what has happened to Layleen Polanco, who we know died on Rikers Island as a result of neglect and her suffering from a seizure and attention not being paid to that. I want to talk to you and start this off, Jai, because Jai, you identify as a transgender woman of color. And
yeah, I do. Yeah.
And Jai, you're the first pre-op transgender female in New York State history to be transferred to a woman's prison. And so I'd like you to talk to you about, Jai, talk to us about what that experience was like for you, right? As a trans person and you being incarcerated and being brought from a man's facility to a woman's facility. What did you experience while there?
Right. Okay. Thank you. Hi to everyone. Thank you for being here. So I think that the overwhelming feeling for me when I was transferred initially was one of pure relief. I didn't realize how much worry and sadness and fear that I held inside of me out of my entire stays in men's correctional facilities, which I did about 6 years and 10 months. I didn't realize how much I was carrying and how often I was trying to protect myself and keep from others. How I felt so like I needed to keep a shell around me, a barrier. My initial feeling when I was transferred was one of pure relief. I almost didn't know how to feel. It was just strange finally being in a place where I didn't have to watch my back, where I didn't have to think that because I wasn't being protected and because my rights weren't being upheld, that something was going to happen to me, that I needed to fear for my life, that I need to worry every minute of every day just so I maintain some sort of security for myself.
Mm-hmm. And Jai, you obviously transitioned to a woman's facility. What was your experience like with the officers there, right? Them knowing that, I'm sure, because your experience is unprecedented in New York State prisons. What was the experience like, right? As we talk about abuses and the way people are mistreated. Talk about that.
Of course. So when I was transferred, I did not receive a warm welcome from security. I remember it was me alone in a van, and when I was made it to Taconic, I was greeted by the deputy of security and the head sergeant. And the first thing that was said to me was, what is your DIN number? So I recited 12A5516. And then I was told, no, you're from now on 19G0010. You know, okay. And then I was told, why you're here, you will not disclose anything about your sexuality. You are not to tell people, even if they ask you, that you are transgendered. You are not to advertise that part of you while you are here. You have 90 days to go before you are released. Let's make this an easy 90 days. I didn't agree with that. I didn't feel like if this was going to be a program that works for so many other people and that helped so many other people, that that was appropriate. I did not believe that to hide who I am and to act like it didn't exist in this environment was okay. So I did just receive a question. What did I learn from Taconic? I'm going to answer that in 1 second. Let me just finish up this thought. And I didn't believe this for multiple reasons. The biggest reason being is this cannot work unless there is complete transparency. This cannot work unless staff and the inmate population realize that this is going to be happening and it's okay that this is happening. The first thing that I did when I was released to my dorm is tell everybody. Subsequently, a couple of days later, I was called down and almost reprimanded as to why you told everyone. And the ways that I just explained was, I did tell everyone because this needs to be transparent. You can't tell somebody that because they don't look feminine enough, like a woman, that this isn't a program that would work for them. That is unacceptable, and that should not be tolerated. So the question said, what did I learn from Taconic? I think the biggest takeaway from Taconic was that the first thing that came to my head right now was that the difference between a men's facility and a women's facility is so drastic and so overwhelming. So when I was in men's facilities, I realized very quickly that the men, they tend to get what they want a lot more often than not. You know, although there are some issues and there are problems, and that might seem crazy to someone who hasn't experienced both sides of it, they as individuals don't stand too close together. But because of who they are and raising awareness for issues, they tend to get what they want and be treated better. The women, on the other hand, are treated a lot worse, but they tend to be closer and more tight-knit. That was something that shocked me as well, because I wasn't used to that. I was so used to being marginalized and misunderstood, and now being in this environment where these women accept me, right? And it doesn't matter what happens with security, I know that these women are going to accept me.
Sure. Thank you for that, too. And then I'm going to circle into Assemblyman Weapon, who I know has championed a lot of different issues. But I want to get to Donna first. Donna Hinton, you joined us, obviously. You're the executive director of A Little Piece of Light. No stranger to the work of lifting up issues of abuse in prisons and jails. And so, Donna, talk to us about like your experience, right, as a person who's had the incarcerated experience and the abuse that you may have experienced yourself or witnessed among the women that you were around while incarcerated.
Thank you all. Good afternoon. Thank you for putting this important conversation together, Andre. It's really important, especially right now. You know, when I got to Bedford in the mid 80s, there was just to go back and give a little history, there was a transgender woman there. Her name was Teresa, and she was exceptionally beautiful. She was a really, really amazingly beautiful, sweet human being. And I remember when I first got there, I was a kid and not being, you know, not understanding the rules of engagement and the system and how it works. And I watched how she would be treated by correctional officer staff, and it wasn't nice. It wasn't good. And then there were others that, you know, it was very rude and quite volatile in its nature. And then there were others that, you know, were oftentimes really propositioning her for sex, which was, I didn't get it at the time, like being new to the system, but like watching it and realizing and having conversations with her and listening to what happened to her, how she, when she was sent to a men's prison, the men's prison across the street at that time, Taconic was men's prison. And then when they realized that she had the full operation, then they sent her across the street to Bedford. But it was just the abuse that she went, you know, she suffered through in both, you know, both places, and the reasons why. So it opened my eyes, and later another transgender woman came in that was, she was just exceptional as well. And, you know, and hearing her story of brutality, you know, and how she was raped when she was in sadistically. And she filed the first lawsuit for transgender rights within the system back then. But me personally, as a cisgendered woman and young woman being in prison, you know, the abuse wasn't different. It really wasn't so different. You know what I mean? Brutality is brutality. There are certain correctional officers who like to feed into that power dynamic, you know, that power and control dynamic that they have over those that they're supposed to care, you know, have care, custody, and control over, right? They take the control way too far. And so, like, for me, when I was in my 30s inside Bedford, there was a correctional sergeant who was using an opportunity to try to sexually assault me quite often. You know, he tried all the time. And the reasons was because my daughter had been a victim of abuse and ran away and ran to the prison to get her mother to help her, right? And this sergeant, this person was given authority over my my case with my daughter and took advantage of it. You know, and one thing I like to really emphasize here is that predators know prey. Predators know prey. And predators oftentimes take the roles of those, take roles and or jobs that can put them in that position to have total control over a person's well-being. And I recognize that because, you know, when we hear these conversations, not to veer off, but I think it's important to show the intersectionality and how that, you know, how that looks in this world. You know, we'll see those in positions of power, and positions of power means that you're a teacher, right? You're a counselor, you're a correctional officer, you're a police officer, you're a priest, you know, all these things that people will gravitate to you looking for help, looking for support, looking for whatever, and you take advantage of that, right? And so I recognize it early from being a victim of abuse and surviving it at a young age, but it continued to happen. And in prison, where it's very abnormal and very, it's very brutal, it is no different. But there, we don't have the opportunity out, you know, to get people to see what's going on.
Sure.
You only hear what they tell you.
Absolutely. And Assemblyman Weapon, I want to just transition to you, Assemblyman Weapon. You know, you've been a champion for a lot of different issues related to criminal justice reform. You are the Assembly Committee Correction Chair. You know, you've called for data on deaths of all individuals in DOC's custody, classified from the months of January 2015 to May 2020. You've really been pushing to access the death records of folk, right, especially like under COVID-19. And now we're here, Assemblyman Weapon, and, you know, we're talking about this idea of transparency as it relates to correctional officers' abuses. And we're not suggesting all correctional officers are like that. But talk to us, Assemblyman Weapon, about, like, what are some of your thoughts around this idea of, like, lethal force being used and the abuses that many officers commit while people are incarcerated?
Well, we got to fight to prevent that, to make sure that doesn't happen. And probably transparency is the best disinfectant we can have. You know, I've fought from the beginning. I've been Sheriff of Corrections since 2017. And I think it was a big advancement to insist that there be cameras all over facilities, because cameras, you know, also provide transparency. But, you know, I'm proud that we've done a number of things in the legislature. And I'm just going to correct what you said before about Governor Cuomo repealing 50A. It was the legislature that did it. The governor signed it. But you know, I was part of that, you know, repeal and some of the reforms that we did. Since I've been in the legislature as chair of this committee, we've raised the age of criminal responsibility to 18. in New York State. We've implemented new rules for discovery and court proceedings to allow defendants to see the evidence being presented against them before a trial. And although we went through a couple of iterations eliminating cash bail, we've eliminated cash bail for most offenses in New York State. That is in addition to a reform package that we passed early this month that you referred to promote transparency and accountability in law enforcement, which included the repeal of 50A, a statute that allowed law enforcement officers, including corrections officers, to refuse disclosure of disciplinary, to refute disclosures of disciplinary personnel records used to evaluate performance. Something very important, as I mentioned, the transparency. And also, in addition, a number of bills that I have sponsored and passed while flying under the radar have brought more transparency to New York's correctional facilities, which in my view is the first step toward providing accountability for those who are acting in unethical, illegal, and plainly wrong ways as they attempt to carry out their duties in the name of our state. Briefly, these enacted bills include measures that require the Correctional Medical Review Board to provide to the legislature and executive an unredacted death report for the death of each and every incarcerated individual, a bill that was put in effect after we saw the report, that we introduced actually after we saw the reports, which were almost totally redacted, and you really couldn't determine what the cause of the death was or what the, what was happening. Ironically, the governor signed that bill in the early part of the pandemic. I think it was probably in early April, which was after we were demanding every week that certain incarcerated individuals be released during COVID-19, older inmates, inmates that were medically compromised, inmates that were not a threat to society, and we kept pressing and then raising some of these issues. I think the pandemic ironically contributed to the governor signing that bill. I think it was in early April. Another bill that establishes the right of the legislative staff to accompany a legislator any correctional facility. That's a bill that I introduced as a result of one of my correction visits to a local jail in Orange County that were housing ICE detainees. And the point was that we wanted under President Trump, the number of ICE detainees that were being held in local jails multiplied by large numbers. There used to be ICE detainees. There were detainees under President Obama as well, but they were detained for a shorter period of time. We made it a crusade to visit state facilities. Albany County, under the sheriff there, was very responsible, allowed us in, was transparent in the data. Orange County, on the other hand, which was, I don't want to be partisan here, but has a Republican elected sheriff who was supportive of Trump, looked at our visit as an intrusion, on them and on the federal administration, and he was very reluctant to allow us in. We actually had to show his corporation counsel, who was with him the entire time, a copy of the statute, which allows every member of the legislature to visit any correctional facility at any time. And I had about 3 or 4 members of my correction committee from the assembly with me on that Orange County visit. So the corporation counsel for Orange County came to the conclusion that, yes, Assemblyman Weapon, we have to let you in and your colleagues in as members of the legislature, but we don't have to let your staff in. And our staff was with us, and they made them wait outside and not in. So what did I do after the visit? I introduced a bill to allow any legislative staff, a mandate that any legislative staff could accompany legislators during these correction visits. And I'm happy to say it passed in both houses, and Governor Cuomo signed it as well. So that came out of one of my correction visits to Orange County, New York.
Sure. Thank you, Assembly Weapon, for that too. And I want to circle into Karen, and then we'll get to Phil. Obviously, Karen, you've been doing the work with, as the Executive Director of Prison Legal Services. And I know that, you've, you've appeared, been worked successful as amicus, right, appearing before the Supreme Court in cases challenging the constitutionality of New York State that prohibited incarcerated people from filing federal 1983 actions in state court, right? You've just been really fighting to push for incarcerated people to access legal services as it relates to abuses too. Talk about some of your experiences with people incarcerated, talking about the abuses they've experienced while there as it relates to correctional officer abuse.
Thanks, Andre, and thanks everybody for this really important webinar. As you know, PLS has been around since 1976. We were created in response to the Attica uprising. The whole point of PLS is to be an outside organization that people that are in prison can write to help them with problems in prison. So we work on conditions of confinement cases. And when you talk about transparency and accountability, that is what we fight for every day. And with respect to this Civil Rights Law 50A, I'd like to talk a little bit about how that impacted, and the repeal has impacted our work. A lot of our work centers around excessive use of force cases, where people are beaten up in prison, or disciplinary cases where people are put in solitary confinement for alleged wrongdoing in the prison. And for years, throughout the 80s and the 90s and the early 2000s, when we would request documents from the Department of Corrections to investigate either a disciplinary hearing or a brutality case, we would get most of the documents. We would get the misbehavior report, the use of force report, the unusual incident report, these memos called to-froms, which are what officers write to the sergeant about the incident. We would get videotapes of the incident. But in around 2010, 2011, all of a sudden, docs started redacting most of these documents. And the redactions didn't make a lot of sense. Sometimes they'd redact the name of our client. They'd redact the place where the incident happened. They'd redact the author of the misbehavior report. And it got worse and worse over a period of time. And ultimately, they relied on Civil Rights Law 58, even though that had been on the books for years. They had never cited that as a reason why we wouldn't be able to receive documents. And what they said was, because what Civil Rights Law 58 said was, if a document might be used in the continuation of employment or for firing or promotion, then it was a personnel record, and those records were exempt from disclosure. So docs made an argument that misbehavior reports and use of force reports and unusual incident reports were now personnel records because they might look at those records to either promote or fire an officer. And so we sued. And we won last year, and the third department found that these are mixed use documents. Yes, they might use them, for personnel reasons, but they're documents that officers have to fill out in the regular course of business. Misbehavior reports have to be written, use of force reports have to be written, and therefore they have to be disclosed to the attorneys who are representing people in prison who are claiming that they were beaten. So we think, great, wonderful victory, this is not going to be a problem. Then we make another FOIL request, and the Department of Corrections says, now you can't have the documents under FOIL because of the law enforcement exemption or the privacy exemption. And we're like, what? We received these documents for years. So again, it was clear to me that they were trying to do an end run around transparency and accountability. So and so now 50A has been repealed, which is great, but now the department is hiding behind FOIL, the FOIL exemptions. So we are in court again, suing docs because they're refusing to turn over videotapes of a incident up at the Clinton Correctional Facility a incident in the yard where there was a small skirmish. Our clients were disciplined for that. Our clients went to their hearing and were able to watch the video at their hearing. But when we asked for the video as their attorneys, Docs has said, no, you can't have the video because it's exempt under FOIL. So it may be that there needs to be another fix under FOIL to promote the accountability and the transparency, because there's no reason at all that the attorney for a client who's being disciplined should not be able to see the videotape of the incident that caused the discipline. So, you know, we run into these hurdles, these barriers, they get put up over and over and over again. But on the flip side of that, as Assemblyman Weprin was saying, we now have cameras in all of the prisons. There are body cameras in 3 or 4 prisons now, and I'm hoping there will be a push for body cameras for all corrections officers. I know it's a funding issue for docs, but one of the police accountability statutes that got pieces of legislation that just got passed does require police to wear body cameras. I just would like to see that extended to corrections officers. And because of PLS litigation over the years, there are now use of force exams. They have to take pictures if there's excessive use of force. So we have made some inroads, but there's still quite a bit to do in terms of ensuring oversight, transparency, and accountability in our state prisons.
And thank you for that, Karen, too, which allows me to segue right into Philip. Philip, you know, you work with the Correctional Association. Correctional Association has been around for 175 years or so. And one of the chief responsibilities of the Correctional Association, obviously, they have the authority under state law to monitor prisons, right? And to report findings to the legislature and the broader public. In light of what we're talking about, Philip, like, talk to us about some of the things that you hear, right, from people that are incarcerated relative to some of the abuses that they experience based on your investigations.
Sure, Andre. I'll give you some official findings, and I'll conclude it with a personal example. So I, you know, as many of the people on the call probably know, I work as the Associate Director of Policy at the Correctional Association of New York. I'm also formerly incarcerated, having served 20 years in DOC's custody. So I also know the issues firsthand. I'll just start with some survey results that we conducted from Auburn, Southport, Elmira, and 5 Points. And so last year we asked, there are 3 questions that we asked that I think are particularly relevant to this panel today. And those questions were, in the past year, have you experienced any form of violence or abuse by staff? And 69.7% of the respondents said yes to that question. The other question was, in the past year, have you witnessed any forms of violence? Have you witnessed any forms of violence or abuse by staff? 82.8% of respondents said yes, I have witnessed staff abuse or violence in the past year. Also asked, in the past year, have you ever witnessed or experienced racist behavior from staff? 76% of respondents said yes, I have witnessed these or experienced these things. You know, and it's not just, and those were maximum security facilities. And so, just to be fair, you know, some people might think, oh, maybe it's just the maxes, maybe the problem is just there. Let's look at a lesser security or lower security facility. So I went back a few years and looked at a Fishkill, which is a medium correctional facility, medium security facility. Look at a 2012 report that the Correctional Association authored about Fishkill. And the relevant portion of that, a key finding from that survey, was that more than 60% of survey respondents reported either hearing about physical confrontations with staff at least frequently, and 90% of respondents reported hearing of confrontations at least once in a while. Violence in prison by staff is a very pervasive problem. It's not limited to just maxes, medium security. Year it's just been for as long as I can remember. And then in contrast, like if you speak to incarcerated people, you'll hear lots of anecdotes and stories and personal experience of police violence, corrections officer violence. But when you look at staff disciplinary records, you don't see that many disciplinary actions for that violence. And so I decided before this call, I went through staff disciplinary records from 2015 to 2019. And what that showed was that there were only approximately 98 disciplinary sanctions for DOC staff for the use of excessive force and for what they deemed also unnecessary force. So that would be a situation where force was not required at all, and they still used it. So only 98, a 3-year period, 98 sanctions against dock staff, despite the prevalence and how widespread this problem is. And I'd say that those numbers from the staff disciplinary records are not an accurate reflection of staff abuse, like the full scope of staff abuse, because those are just the cases that were actually alleged, substantiated, and punished, right? A lot of things don't get punished or not substantiated in docs to their level of satisfaction. During one of my monitoring visits to a state correctional facility last year, I spoke with some doc central office staff, and we talked about the issue of violence in prison, and they told me, listen, we hear about this stuff all the time, but the problem is there's no camera footage. The staff, the sergeants, everyone lie to protect each other. And when they do that, even the OSI investigations that take place are thwarted. They cannot realistically or based on any kind of evidence come to any conclusion that supports the real allegations of what actually happened, because the staff actually lie to cover each other and protect each other as much as they can. And then I'll just say that the fear of abuse and retaliation in docs is so palpable that when we go on monitoring visits and we're speaking with incarcerated people in their cells or in their living areas, the moment they think a doc staff member is too close to us, they drop down to a very, very low whisper so that no one else can hear. And if they think the whisper can't work, they'll switch over to gestures and try to start sign language, signing things to you so that they don't have to speak. And then if that doesn't work, then they'll say, listen, I'll just send you a letter. And it's because of the fear is so ingrained in everyone. Like everyone inside the prison knows what doc staff members do. And it's definitely something that needs attention. And I'll just give another personal experience example. When I was waiting to enter the doc system many years ago, and I was arrested at 19, there were old timers in the jail that I was in who were giving me advice on how to carry myself and get through the doc system, right? And so they told me, listen, when you go through the reception center, downstate correctional facility, do every single thing those officers tell you to do. Don't deviate by the slightest amount, because they will jump on you, kick your teeth out. They will really mess you up, right? And so I was like, all right, I kept that in the back of my mind. Then I get to downstate correctional facility, and everything that they explained to me was true. And it wasn't just because other guys said, oh, I heard the same thing. The COs literally walk into the room and give you a list. They tell you a list of things. They say, if you do this, this, and this, we will break your bones. If you look at a female officer, we will break your bones. If you talk back, we will break your bones. This level of violence, this is reception. So this is your first introduction into the doc system. And it just shows how pervasive the violence is, and that from day one, they try to normalize and make you accept that staff violence in response to anything is the normal course of action. So this problem goes way, way deeper than many people realize. It's a difficult culture to challenge, but that's what we're dealing with right now.
Sure, and thank you for that, Phil. And consistent with that thought, right, the idea of racism, right, permeating the prisons throughout New York State, and the behavior that follows from staff, right, against folk who are incarcerated, right, is pretty rampant. And so, Donna, talk to us about your experiences while, when you're talking about women being incarcerated, right, and being exposed to different forms of violence, verbally or otherwise, right, where people are making advances, some staff are making advances toward women, sexually and otherwise. Talk to what was that like for women who actually experienced that? And I'm sure talk to you and others about what they encountered and the trauma that they experienced from those things.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Andre. It's really important. First, I want to get to something that was said. Anissa, I want to recognize you right now that you called out language. We have to be very mindful, especially, we're educators here, how we define people. And so using terms as inmate and all those things are not things that we promote. So I just wanted to say that. I wanted to recognize that in questions. So, being a woman in prison, I'm not going to take anything from my brothers, but I have to say being a woman in prison is extremely difficult. There's such a level of, I don't even know how to describe that. The level of things that happen to women in prison that rob us of our dignity, rob us of just our basic humanity is just mind-boggling. I mean, I have to be a little graphic to really give you an example of what I mean. And most everyone on this on this panel understands, and the audience understands. But, being a woman, we have a cycle every month, right? And we have certain needs to take care of that cycle every month. In prison, we found ourselves having to beg, barter, and sometimes steal to take care of our needs, our monthly needs. And what I mean by that, there was a time where one of my friends, sisters, who was having her monthly cycle, ran out of sanitary supplies. And, you have to go to an officer, for the most part, when you're inside, to ask for extra supplies or supplies, right? And so when you're a woman and you're on your cycle, it's kind of embarrassing, and it's kind of, it takes something from you. You have to go to someone to get the things that you need for it. And then when you have to go to a man, it's even more dehumanizing, right? And just ugly. And so it was at that moment when she had to go to a male officer at the bubble to ask for supplies to take care of her monthly cycle, where we realized that we've been led and manipulated, into this situation and controlled by this situation, because we had to rely on somebody else to say here. And it went so far, and it could go so far as to that person, whoever it is, male or female, but especially a man, to say, well, what do you need it for? Well, let me see proof. They take it to an extra level of dehumanization, to tell a woman, well, let me see why, show me why you need extra supplies, right? What do you need? All these questions and things, it's just so dehumanizing. And so we fought for to change that in Bedford, and as a result, there's a fight across the country now for dignity for incarcerated women that represents, that's also included, that issue. But there are other things too. I remember being there, I think I was there a couple of years at Bedford. I was still young. I went, I got there, I was 21. And so I think I was like 23, 22. And an officer who was managing the lobby area, so it's like a tunnel area, was propositioning me, telling me that, oh, I'll get you some gum and bring you some sandwiches and some perfume, basically, if you give me sex. And I was just like, what? First of all, I was still trying to understand how I got there, and all the things that are going on with me, my daughter, there was so much stuff. And I felt like, well, what do I say to this person? Put me in a position like, what do I say? How do I respond to an officer who I know has the keys, who has control over me and could do harm to me? Because it's happened. We hear stories of some women that have so-called committed suicide in prisons. They didn't commit suicide. I'm here to tell you, they were murdered. One particular young woman in Albion many years ago, people like to say you get into relationships with officers or whatever. You don't get into relationships because it's not consensual. It makes absolutely no sense, right? That's how we got the law created, where it's a crime, it's rape, right? But this certain young lady was pregnant by a correctional officer in Albion. And because when they found out, all of a sudden she was dead in her cell, hanging, so-called suicide. We kind of knew better. You just know it's not the case. But it's hard to let the public know what's going on and how it's happening. Number one, because women especially, we are not the first people that people think about when we talk about incarceration. We don't think about the conditions of women. We don't consider the people visiting women and just trying to maintain a relationship with them, because we just don't. And that's why I fight. That's why, I created this organization to continue to fight for us and to maintain this level of awareness throughout this world. Just like, hey, women are incarcerated as well, and the treatment in which we go through is really cruel and inhumane. It's dehumanizing. You wouldn't even treat your dog that way. You wouldn't treat an animal the ways in which we're treated when we're incarcerated. And I'm not saying it's not, you know, people like, oh, well, you shouldn't have done the time, you shouldn't have the crime and whatever. It has nothing to do with that, how you treat people. A woman shouldn't have to bring her used sanitary pad to an officer or anyone, say, here, this is why I need another pad. This is why I need another set of supplies. That, I mean, who does that? But this is what we have to do. Well, I have to yell out to an officer, hey, why I need help, medical help. So I have to like tell you my whole entire problem or issue for you, who I have to go through this barrier to deem it, well, okay, I'll let you see an medical today, or I'll let you see mental health today, or I'll let you see whatever today. It shouldn't be like that. It should not. The system should not be set up in that way, but it is. It is. There's so many levels of brutality and abuse that I don't think we have time for today, you know. But I just thought something as simple as that people take for granted, that women that just simply on their cycle have to go through so much dehumanization, levels of disrespect, just to get basic necessities.
And thank you for that, Donna, too. And, you know, I want to make sure now, I just want to get just everyone's like call to action, some things people can start doing, right? Some ways to look at different reforms. You know, Assemblyman Weprin, you know, you've had some legislative wins that have been obviously successful in many different ways. To Karen's point, however, there's still some areas that need work, right, that we have to begin to change. You know, starting with you, Assemblymember Weprin, what are some of the things, some of the reforms that you think, some other reforms that can happen, possibly in corrections, in docks, to prevent abuses in that way? I know obviously we have cameras now in prisons, right? We have some body cameras specifically in some of the prisons, but that's not enough, obviously, because those cases are still emerging. Just from your thinking, Assemblyman Weprin, what are some of the other things that we can do to really address this issue of abuse and have real accountability and transparency? Thank you, Assemblymember Weprin.
Yeah, I mean, there's probably a lot more we can do, but as it is now, we haven't done enough, even with the body cameras, as Karen pointed out. You know, for correction officers, you know, having the body cameras very important, as well as, you know, having cameras in all the facilities. We're actually, one of the bills that came out of committee last week that is going to the floor hopefully this week, that I'm hoping to pass, is based on something Philip Miller mentioned earlier with the Correctional Association, how important it is to allow the Correctional Association to have access to the facilities and to outside of the personnel of docks. Whenever I have a visit to any state facility or local facility, I always meet with the ILC, the Inmate Liaison Committee, and I always insist that it be out of the presence of docks employees, because as was pointed out, you know, if incarcerated individuals feel, you know, that docks is listening, or the correction officer listening, or the superintendent, or, you know, officials at docks are listening, they're going to be very hesitant to be honest and to talk openly. And that's probably the most important part of my visit, is to have those meetings with incarcerated individuals, with the Inmate Liaison Committee, with some of their issues that we bring to the attention, you know, of the superintendent, and have had changes as well. So this particular bill that we came out of committee last week would allow the correctional associations to have the same right as they examine facilities, and they have been doing for, you know, as somebody points out, they've been around for 175 years. You know, they don't have the right to have, you know, visits unrestricted without having docks employees there in their presence. So that's one of the bills that we have that I hope to pass this week, which would allow the Correctional Association to meet with incarcerated individuals out of the hearing of docks officials, and to actually make changes and listen to suggestions. So, it's legislation like that. One of the other bills I'm going to be doing this week, and it becomes even more important in light of the pandemic and the fact that visitation was virtually ended, cut off completely, during COVID-19, and I'm hoping it'll be easing up shortly, is to require seven-day visitation in all facilities, minimum, medium, and maximum. And that came out of my first budget as chair of the correction committee a few years ago, and I think it was in 2017, when the governor was trying to save about $2 million in a $2 billion correction budget by cutting visitation in maximum security facilities from 7 days to 3 days a week. And then during that battle, and we had all the advocates, we had press conferences, we had thousands of demonstrations, we had a kind of our own little movement among incarcerated individuals' families, and we were very successful in that, where the governor actually withdrew that cut in the middle because of the protests, because of the public support. That seemed like a small thing, but then I realized, there's no 7-day visitation in minimum and medium security, that they can limit visitation, and generally it's limited to weekends. So I said, it doesn't make any sense why you should be able to have 7-day visitation in maximum security facilities, but not medium and minimum. So I'm hoping that bill will finally pass this week and be signed by the governor.
Sure. Thank you, Assemblyman Weapon. And, there's been conversation, and people have been lifting up the idea of having what would be considered an independent review board, right, for some of the abuses, some of the things that are happening, because to use oftentimes the very state measures to engage and hold people accountable is just not enough. So Karen, talk to us a little bit about thoughts on that, right? Like an independent review board coupled with some other recommendations around reforms to address accountability and transparency and brutality that are occurring in the jails and prisons.
Sorry, I had to unmute myself. Thank you for that question. It's incredibly important. I do believe there is a correctional ombudsman bill out there that's floating around, but I don't think it's gone anywhere yet. But that's pretty much what it would be. A couple years ago, the legislature held hearings on oversight, and I testified along with a number of other people about the need to have some independent agency, organization that has full and complete access and oversight of docs. The Correctional Association is wonderful, but they are limited statutorily in terms of what they can do and what information they get. I mean, that could be broadened to give them the authority. But I think we need such an agency. Or organization, and it should be outside of the politics of it all, because what's happened in the past with things that are done like that is that if a different person becomes governor or the legislature flips, then those organizations get defunded, and even though they have the authority to perform oversight, they don't have the resources to do so. So I think when you look at doing something like that, you have to be very careful about how it gets set up and structured. So it is a standalone independent organization that will be impacted ever so slightly by politics. So I think that's number one. Number two, I think that there's a number of bills that are out there. There's the less is more bill for parole. There's the elderly parole bill. There's the HALT bill, which would severely limit solitary confinement. There's the fair and timely parole bill. There's the Minimum Wage Act. There's, which would raise the salaries for incarcerated, or the wages for incarcerated individuals for all the work they do. And let me just say here that we've received so many letters from incarcerated individuals that wanted us to get the word out that they were so proud to be helping during COVID-19. There was a lot of criticism that we're not paying what we should be paying, that hand sanitizer in the beginning wasn't even available in the prisons, and all that was true and accurate and criticism that should have been out there. But at the same time, there were a number of individuals working so hard to make masks and make hand sanitizer, and they wrote to me and they said, I just wish people knew that we care about New York State and people that live here, and we're doing everything we can to help. So people should know that. But I think that if you look at all of these bills that are out there, from all the parole bills to the minimum wage to HALT, the underlying issue that makes those bills necessary is the continued racial disparity and racism that we have in this state and in this country. And the New York Times wrote about it in 2016, and they had a series of articles about the racial disparity in our prisons. And it's not just in the prison, then it's within the prison. It's who goes to solitary, who doesn't get paroled, who doesn't get the certain programs or educational opportunities in prison that will help them successfully reintegrate into society. So along those lines, I received a letter a couple weeks ago from a guy in one of our state prisons, and he said, I don't understand it. We've done so much on rape and sexual abuse in prisons. We have the Prison Rape Elimination Act. We have a lot of focus on that. Why aren't we doing more about racism? And, it got me thinking, and I wrote a letter to the commissioner. I sent a copy actually to Assemblyman Weapern, so he's seen it, but about focusing on that, and it has to come from the top down, but it could be called the Prison Racism Elimination Act. And there could be an entire effort of the state to focus on racial disparities outside and inside prison, and all the things that happen in prison that are from racism. So, and so we can pass all the bills we want to pass, and maybe we can improve parole, maybe we can reduce solitary confinement, maybe we can increase wages. But until we address the underlying problem of racism, I don't think we're going to make our prisons that much better or our communities that much better.
Right, because some maintain, Karen, that the criminal justice system is simply a byproduct of the racism that exists in society. And that's really important. And we know that in addressing brutality within prisons, right, it's also a matter of like addressing leadership and a matter of political will too. And this is no way it suggests to point to you, Assemblyman Weapern. We know you're on the ground, like doing some great work, but obviously there's others who you'll need to be in partnership with or to support you in advancing the things that will address some of the abuses in prisons and jails. And, Diamond, I want to circle back to you. We're going to open up the chat for a couple of questions to be answered. But, Diamond, as a Latinx trans person, right, who's obviously had these experiences, what are some of the things that you'd like to share with our panel as it relates to how trans folk are treated in prisons and jails? What clarion call could you put out there for people to support changing the conditions that people who identify as trans are experiencing in jails and prisons?
Right. So I just want to clarify, I am white and Black. I'm not Spanish. I know it can be a little confusing. I get it. But a great question. I do strongly feel that the employees of corrections that are there to protect the individuals in which they serve need to reflect the communities that they are there to protect. I do not feel safe when I am whitewashed. I do not feel safe when I am sent through a system in which I know these people who don't look like me are against me. However, everyone looks like that person. I don't feel safe when there's nobody who I can turn to and feel like we can relate. I think that unless these things change, right? Like Karen said, unless there is systematic racial change, unless people understand the importance that unless racism no longer exists, these problems will still exist. These problems will continue, right? Because as women know, as men who are incarcerated know, as trans people like myself who are incarcerated, we all have varying difficulties. Not to say that my struggles are different from Donna's struggles, or that Donna's struggles are different from Philip's struggles, right? They're the same, they're just different in how they affect that person and the communities of those people. Again, I'm a strong believer that Docs needs to employ outward change within its employees and who they hire and how they can show themselves to the population in which they serve. Trans people every day incarcerated are being harassed. They are being disparaged. They are marginalized and misunderstood. They're being attacked. When I walk past an officer and he tells another inmate to burn down my cube where I have to live, I no longer feel safe, right? When I'm a victim in 2016 of sexual assault and the inmates say, we are going to lie for the police because we don't want you living here, I am a victim. I no longer feel safe. When for that same incident, I spend 90 days in the box without a ticket, and after 5 days, my attacker gets to walk out of the box, I no longer feel safe in the entirety of Dallas. I don't care which prison I'm in. I don't care who's in front of me. And I'm sorry if I'm upset at everyone who I come into contact with. I'm sorry if you think that I'm an angry person. I'm sorry if you feel like I'm not getting transitional services. But I'm not, and I can never. Unless I learn and have the strength, which unfortunately so many people, trans people, women, men of varying backgrounds and ethnicities, right, don't have. I'm lucky that I do, and I'm lucky that fellow people who have gone through the system have that drive within them, right? These are the people just that haven't been broken by the system and or life, right? And this is sad. So again, I have to reiterate, unless the dialogue changes, unless the narrative speaks on employees who reflect the communities in which they're there to protect, there can be no change.
And thank you for that, Jai. Diamond, we appreciate that too. And I know someone asked the question about what is the definition of racism. I'll give a very loose definition, right? And so, at least from my vantage point, you know, the definition of racism has all to do with power and privilege, and the ability to use that power and privilege to negatively impact the lives of other human beings, right? So that's a loose definition, and others have definitions as well. But Phil, like recommendations, right? Things that we can be in action with, because we're not going to rest until there's some real meaningful change as around transparency and accountability that starts obviously with addressing the major elephant in the room, as Karen talked about, which is racism, right? That's one of the major things. And then making sure that we're engaging communities, engaging incarcerated people to really challenge the issue of brutality and abuse in prisons. So Phil, some recommendations, some other thoughts you'd like to share.
Sure, and so I'll say an immediate call to action would be for everyone to call their local legislators today and express support for S8046 and A10194. That's the bill that Assemblymember Weapon was discussing earlier. And greatly increase the Correctional Association's access to information, probably that it hasn't had since prior to 1973, when its power was restricted. But transparency is a huge part of this issue and part of the solution. And I'll say it's not the entire solution, because I think transparency is great and we definitely need it, but what's still missing and what we should still discuss in the community is accountability. What are we going to do with this information once we get it, right? We can go in now and get it. We've got this bill passing. By the way, it just passed the Senate Codes Committee a few minutes ago. One step closer to the floor for a full vote now. But getting transparency, which we're trying to do right now, and it's not just for us. Like, the bill is for access for the Correctional Association, but it's really for the people who are still incarcerated now, because they're the ones who are continuing to have to deal with the issues that seem to have gone on forever and ever and seem to have no end in sight. And so we're hoping that bill gets passed. But again, as I said, if anyone can just express as much support as possible to local legislators for those two bill numbers, S8046, A10194. And then if that gets passed, you know, we can also be glad to speak with other advocacy organizations, with Donna, with Jay, with everybody, to see, now that we have this kind of access, what are the questions we need to ask and what kind of information do we need to take out, get from docs so that we can move the needle forward. And then just going forward, I'll add on to what Karen Murtaugh mentioned earlier. You know, state violence isn't always in the form of brutality or you know, that kind of thing. But it also comes in the form of parole denials and solitary confinement and things like that. And so I'd also ask that everyone on the call also reach out to legislators to support elder parole and fair and timely parole and halt solitary bill and the walking while trans bill and the Protect Our Courts Act and a bunch of other bills. But you know, the change is incremental, and as advocacy community, I think we all need to just focus on as many things as possible. There's times when momentum will, you know, guide our discussion into what we focus on for a particular moment has a chance of getting passed, but in general, we should not lose sight of all the other things that still need to change. And as I said before, the one thing that's really missing still is accountability. So we can make reports, we can bring stuff to the legislature's attention, to the governor's attention, but until people can get past the nice scope of union and start firing officers and respond to the abuse that they do, you know, I think a lot of the stuff might still continue, but transparency is definitely a great first step, but we do need to hold them accountable.
Thank you for that, Phil, too, because there's also been instances, you know, where staff or employees at docks experienced being criminally prosecuted, but they were rarely convicted, right? And so that's a huge challenge as well. And so, you know, we had some couple of questions. I think Phil's one of the folk who've tuned into this wanted you just to put into the chat box the number of those bills so people can also access them as well. And then I'll open this up. Let me just see if there's any other questions that we have for our panelists here. When are legislators and others not in prison stop using dehumanizing language? Somebody said that. My name is Shamika, released from prison 103 days ago. I'm unable to join the discussion. Unfortunately, Shamika, we would certainly like for you to reach out to one of us, maybe in the chat, so we can access your information, so we can get in contact with you. We have all our colleagues on this panel, Donna, all of us here, we can be able to contact you. And someone asks, could mental health advocacy for either the incarcerated individuals and or the correctional officers play a role in any of this? So if anyone cares to answer that question, please.
Let me jump right in here and say that prisons and jails are not the response, should never be the response for mental health issues. That we have to get out of that mindset. It is not the response for drug addiction. It is not the response for mental health. It is not the response for poverty. It's not the response for education. It's not the response for health, overall health. It is not the response, right? It's just not the response. So we should try to reimagine the system. I think we should first, you know, one of the things that a lot of us on this call, on this webinar focus on is how do we reinvest in our communities. And Assemblyman Weprin, we have this conversation times, you know, it's like, you know, we talk about bills, we talk about things, but we can do two things at one time. We think when it comes to the system, the prison industrial complex, that we can only do one thing. We can do two things, 3, 4, 5 things at one time. So when we talk about reimagining a system that is more rehabilitative and corrections based than it is punitive and brutal, we can do other things. So we should look at how do we reinvest in communities. We should look at what happened and what years it happened and what caused it to happen, where mental health facilities, even though they weren't so well, but they were still response to mental health, were no longer the avenue to go and everyone went to prison. Why did that happen? When did that happen? How do we look to kind of like reverse that, right? When did we start seeing an influx of people being sent to prison because they were addicted to drugs and probably sold drugs or whatever to get the drugs to manage their addiction, right? It's a cycle, right? We should look at that and see what happened. We kind of know already, but I'm saying we have to reimagine this. We can't continue to look at the system to respond to these things and be the place for people to get their needs met. That should not be. Not when they're severe like that. And I can see if it was mild or whatever. We know that people are going to commit crimes, so we know we have to have systems in place to deal with that. Let's be very clear. We're not a healed people yet. So we're not healed, and so we see crimes. We see murders. We see it on the rise. We see gangs and stuff like that. We have to figure some things out differently, right? But it's not prison. Prison is not the response to all those other issues. So let's think about what would mental health facilities or mental health treatment look like now today in 2020? What would substance abuse addiction look like now in 2020 where prison isn't connected to all these issues? And then let's look at prison as well, prison and jail, and make sure that as soon as a person walks into them, the first thing that they're focused on is their re-entry, because 95% of people are going to get out at some point. I don't care, 27 years later, 30 years later, whatever, 10 years later, they're going to get out. So let's focus on that. We can do all these things at one time. So let's reimagine that, and not what, but we know, and to get to that about correctional officers getting mental health, we know that they really, I mean, you don't need much to become an officer. Like really just take the civil service test, right? That's fine. But there has to be something better in place. But the thing is, this is not going to change until we focus on the communities where all of us come from. Because the correctional staff comes from the same communities that a lot of the people who are incarcerated come from. And so you still have that level of violence, of poverty, of this thing where we're not worthy. And so if the same people come from a community and they're told they're not worthy, they're not valued, they don't mean anything, regardless of the job, the role that they take on, they still have that inside of them. So they're going to look at themselves, they're going to reflect, they're going to, you know what I'm saying, project. Oh, you look just like me, so you're like me, not worthy. And you're a criminal, you're a convict. Let's use the words where they needed to be used, right? And so I'm going to treat you bad because this is the only way I can feel good about myself. So we have to understand the methodology behind that, and then not look to the system to be the response or to have these answers. We have to do it. We have to do it differently.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Donna, too. And I just want to have some closing, just wrap up thoughts, right? The Fortune Society will continue to partner with everyone on this call to make sure we're advancing some real legislative changes, although we have some already with Assemblyman Weapon and Senator Sepulveda and others, but also rallying to make sure that there's true accountability for the abuses that exist in prison. So just a couple of closing thoughts from each of you as we're moving toward the ending of this panel. There'll be a series of other panels and rallies and other things that we'll be partnering with all of you to do in different ways. So we definitely want to make sure we keep this momentum going. I'll start with Assemblyman Weapon. Any closing thoughts, Assemblyman Weapon? And once again, thank you so much for joining this panel today. We appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you, Andre. And I want to thank the Fortune Society for putting this together. I'm able to pass the legislation that I pass in Albany and advocate for because of all of you, because of the advocates, because of you bringing to the public's attention some of these issues. I know during this pandemic, I was on a number of calls. I know Donna was on many of those calls over the last 3-4 months. And it's because of what you bring to us information-wise that we're able to get that out to the public and to advocate for some of this legislation. So again, I want to thank organizations like the Fortune Society, like all of you, like the Correctional Association, like Donna's organization, all of you, like Karen Murtaugh and Prisoner Legal Services that we play a major part in advocating and funding for. It's because of the work that you all do that we're able to do the work that we do in the legislature. So I want to thank you for your partnership and for working with us, because I couldn't do this without that partnership. Thank you.
Absolutely, Senator Weapon. Diamond, some closing comments, right? Some things you'd like to share with our listening audience as you'll continue to be partnering with us to advance these kind of legislative wins that we're looking to achieve. So Diamond, any comments and last thoughts?
Yeah, of course. Thank you. So thank you everyone to be here, for being here. This has been so great. I do want to say that this conversation never ends. This narrative, it doesn't need to change. It can't afford to change, because when it changes, the momentum loses, right? You all might be looking on your social media feeds and seeing that what were great, strong issues a month ago, 2 months ago, now your pages are back to normal, right? I feel like these conversations need to be at the forefront of what we do, what we're here to do, of helping our communities and individuals who need us every single day. So I'm just super grateful to be here, and thank you all for your time.
Phil, some closing comments and thoughts. You've mentioned the bills that Corrections Association is looking to, is seeking to advance. Fortune supports that work. Some closing comments and thoughts.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you to everyone who's on the panel and everyone who's listening in right now. no change can happen without, any and all of us working together to make it happen. I also want to say special thanks to Dave, Mr. Assemblymember Refrin, for actually sponsoring the bill. I don't know if I froze or not.
No, we hear you. We hear you, Philip.
Yeah, I want to say thanks to Assemblymember Refrin for actually sponsoring the bill to expand correctional associations' oversight ability. It's a great step forward. And then I'll just close by saying, there's always a lot of attention, and it's due, but there's always a lot of attention on alternatives to incarceration, and also on the other end, on the reentry part. But a lot of people forget about what happens to the people in the middle. The people who actually end up in prison have to spend decades inside, right? And so I'm just thankful that the people on this call who are paying attention and fighting right now for our bill and for similar bills have not forgotten about the people who are still incarcerated, and realize that it's just as important as the ATI side and the reentry side. And I think we should just continue fighting as much as possible. And I'm always willing, correctional association is always willing to support anything that can move our cause forward.
Sure. And Karen, obviously with Prison Legal Services and the work that you all are doing and the commitment that Prison Legal Services has toward addressing these issues, some closing thoughts, Karen. And you're muted, Karen. Yeah, you're muted.
Thank you. I've been at PLS since 1983, and I have to say, I think Assemblyman Weprin is a bit too humble. And it obviously, I think all the advocates doing all the work that they do helps him in getting legislation passed. But we have never had a corrections chair that has passed so many formidable bills that positively impact the incarcerated population in New York State. So I want to personally and publicly thank Assemblyman Weprin for his tenacity and perseverance. Often these are very difficult issues, and they're hard fought on the other side. The whole visitation thing a couple of years ago, there was a whole package thing where they wanted to have secure vendors only be able to send packages into the prisons. And Assemblyman Weprin has been there every step of the way. So thank you so much to him. And thank you to all of the advocates. I think like Jai was saying, don't stop the narrative, don't stop talking about this, and we all have our piece. I mean, PLS, we're a law firm, so we go into court, and then there's the Correctional Association who can go into the prisons and actually see things that we can't even see, and there's Fortune, who's helping thousands of people who are coming out, and then Donna's organization. I mean, everybody is focused on one piece of this gigantic puzzle. And it is gigantic. We receive 10,000 letters a year. In fact, since COVID happened, that number has just exploded. So let's all continue to work together, continue to support one another. And I think that, I've been doing this for 30 some years, and I have seen some change. We've got a long way to go, but we're moving in a good direction. So thank you all, and thank you, Fortune and Andre, for putting this together. It's been wonderful.
Sure. We're going to close with Donna, and just again acknowledging Assemblymember Weprin, knowing how incredibly difficult it is sometimes to navigate the terrain you're in. Again, we just want to acknowledge that too. Donna, closing thoughts, and then we're going to wrap this up. But again, this conversation will continue to happen. We'll continue to rally around this issue and look for us putting out some more things so that people can join on to this real important issue that we're talking about today. Donna?
Yeah, I just want to echo everyone's thanks to you, Assemblyman Weprin, because of our conversations, our Friday conversations for the last few months. We've been able to get some pregnant women out of prison, and we've been able to change some of the situations that are in prison right now during COVID, because it's real. COVID is real, and it's real in prison, right? And we talk about brutality. We have to understand what happens to people that are not able, they have no autonomy over their livelihoods or their well-beings. And so I just want to call that out and say that we need to continue to have these conversations. We need to continue to call out these measures, these things, these issues that are hurting our people. We have to understand that people in prison can get COVID and die. And everyone was not sentenced to a death sentence, right? And if they were, should not be in such an inhumane and egregious way. So I just want to call that out. And so I'm really thankful working with Assemblyman Weprin and some of the other legislatures to get some of this stuff done. But I also want people not to leave this webinar with just, you heard some good, speakers or thoughts or whatever. Please get involved with the work that we're all doing. My organization, A Little Piece of Light, we're focused on women's issues. We're focused on making sure that the women in prison get the things that they need. We focus on legislation to get them out, those that deserve a second chance. But I think everyone deserves a second chance, but that's my thought. I also want everyone to just really understand that this is not just a one-time thing. This is not a moment, people. This is a movement. Someone said something, how can we get people to understand that, like how Black Lives Matters is now into the mainstream? Well, I just want to be very clear that we've been fighting for Black Lives Matter, Black lives from way back since I went into the system as an adolescent in the 80s. And so this just didn't happen here, right? And now this has been going on for quite some time. They kill, the knees are in the necks of people, Black and brown people in the system as well, and they're murdered and brutalized as well, right? What happens after the cuffs come off is what we need to do, show people, because we know this is all related. And so I just ask that you all please not just leave this conversation, but reach out and see what you could do to help. Where do you want to help? What does help look like? What does support look like? Right? And just continue this conversation. But also, it's time to vote, people. It's time to vote. And just leave it with this, that we're creating a voters coalition. So get our people to register the vote and get them out to vote, because it's very important. Our lives depend on it, literally.
Absolutely. And again, thank you, everyone. This is an action-oriented virtual panel, So I want to thank you, Karen, Phil, Donna, Diamond, and Assemblyman Weprin, again, so much for all of the work that you are doing and will continue to do as we remain in action with addressing these most important issues. Everyone be safe. To all of those who joined this panel, be well and continue to be in action with supporting the work that all of us are committed to. Thank you so much. Everyone be safe and be well.
Y'all stay safe.
Good, thank you.